Welcome to Inner and Outer Worlds.
Hey guys, welcome to Inner and Outer Worlds. I'm your co-host, Zach Hanania, along with my brother, Jordan Hanania. And we are here to talk to you guys about science and spirituality. Our intention for this podcast is to help people gain a greater appreciation of life by broadening their understanding of every aspect of life, from our inner worlds to our outer worlds. And our inner worlds are what we call our consciousness, our inner thoughts, our inner feelings, and the outer world, obviously the physical reality. And we got a decent dude to talk about the physical reality.
Decent, yeah.
Jordan's a PhD student in medical physics, so he is really into obviously physics, but also getting into biology as part of his work. And yeah, man, the study of life. We'll get into chemistry, and it's just unpacking all aspects of reality so we can gain a greater understanding of it, navigate our lives better, and gain a deeper appreciation for all things.
Well said. In other words, we're talking about cool, trippy shit that you might think about sometimes, maybe after, little smoke of a joint or something. Your brain tends to go to think about crazy stuff, and hopefully we'll satisfy things like that. And like Zach said, that gives a deeper appreciation for your external outer world and your inner worlds. So it'll be a good fun time. I'm excited.
I'm very excited. I find the more I learn about anything in these areas, it's like, holy shit. And you just appreciate everything.
It's a rabbit hole everywhere you look.
It really is infinite.
Yeah,
what there is to learn.
Like the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know about things, because you can just go so deep into each little nook and cranny of like every subject, like math, physics, chemistry. Like they all just have so much you can delve into.
Yeah, but
We'll definitely get into lots of detail with things, but I think giving like a broad strokes picture of I'll try to give the broad strokes of the science, and then us together, and mostly you, will paint some spiritual insights and whatnot, and hope to tie those fields together as well.
Basically, both areas, even though they've been very much separated in the public eye for hundreds of years now, it's like silly to separate them, because they're both just studying reality and what we have around us.
Yeah.
And it's silly to exclude them from each other, because they're both getting at the same thing. They're both just trying to find truth. And being that we are not just emotionless, soulless beings just bumping around each other and just experiencing the physical world, we have deep inner worlds, and we have a consciousness, and that is common, it seems like, amongst all people and all beings, all living things. We can't discredit that when we're trying to analyze our experience of life, so it's important to bring in the spiritual aspect, as well as obviously the science that has given us so many amazing inventions and is the reason why our lives are so easy these days.
Well, there's a couple things I want to note, even with regards to science, is that the two main big theories of science, like quantum field theory or quantum mechanics and general relativity, both have this weird thing about them where they're both like observer dependent. It's the phenomena within each of these big fields are highly dependent on the observer, or like we tend to call it an observer and not like a conscious experiencer or something like that. But both theories, oddly enough, have this dependence on who is making the observation or who is making the measurement. And that's like kind of a weird quirk that you might not expect to, like, that the physical reality would tie into the need for an observer. But it seems that our best theories inevitably run into that, where it's like some observer is making these measurements or is observing the speeds and world views of space and time and stuff like this. So it's kind of like inevitable that you're going to get tied in with, again, we call it an observer, but what is that? Probably a conscious observer at some level. So
That's right. And do you want to talk about the slit experiment with the observation effect and how that impacts that experiment? Because I feel like that will really describe how intimately connected to our environment we are and how that affects science.
So that's the quantum mechanics side of that, where, I mean, this is a general quantum mechanics phenomena, is that the observer influences the experiment or the outcome, and therefore like the reality in some level. The experiment you're talking about is the double slit experiment, where you have two slits in like a screen and you shoot light through that, and then on the screen behind these two slits you observe what the pattern is. So if you imagine this isn't too controversial, where people even like a few hundred years ago thought that light was a wave. So let's say you shoot a wave at two different slits, like you can imagine a water wave hitting two openings in a wall. Each opening is going to now cause their own wave pattern to emerge from each opening or slit, and those will interfere with each other. And on the wall behind that you're observing, you'll see this interference pattern.
In a wave state.
Yeah, in a wave state. So that's the water and that's the light. And people weren't too surprised when you do that with light. But then people started doing that experiment with like electrons, which are massive particles, and particles don't behave like waves, or at least they thought they didn't. But if you shoot a bunch of electrons through these double slits, you don't just see two lines on the back screen, which you'd expect. Like, let's say now you have two holes in your wall in your room, and you're throwing like tennis balls through those holes, and there's a wall in the far background. You'd expect, like, where you throw the tennis ball through those holes, there to be a line of hits on the wall, you know?
Ball marks.
Like ball marks, exactly. So you'd expect just two lines. These are balls, like particles, flying through the wall, hitting the wall in a line. So you'd get two discrete lines. But instead, when you do that experiment with quantum mechanics, you get... so the key thing is that we shoot a single electron
Through the slit.
We don't know which slit it's going to go through. That's the thing, is that if we don't know which slit it's going to go through, we see that it gives you an interference pattern instead of two discrete lines.
Interference pattern being a wave?
Yeah, being like a wave form on the opposite wall. So if we shoot the electron in and don't measure which slit it's going through, we see it behaving like a wave. So that's weird. But now if we say, okay, let's see, like, does the electron go through slit 1 or slit 2? And we can put a little detector at slit 1, so that when the electron goes through slit 1, we're like, okay, it went through slit 1. Now what happens on the background screen? It stops to behave like a wave, and now you get those two lines of it behaving like it's a tennis ball or like a particle. So by measuring it, by interfering with the system as an external observer, you influence what's going on. Even though we haven't really done anything, it's more or less just us observing. Although, in order to observe, you need to inevitably interact with the system. So any detector of that slit, of the particle going through the slit, will in the case of an electron, you'll have to like bounce some light off of it or something. So you are interfering with the system, but it's still very strange that this particle goes from like a wave-like behavior of it can be in any place along the back screen, and just from us interacting with it at one of these slits, it's like, okay, I've decided now to change my behavior. So this is just the one example within quantum mechanics of this observer effect.
So to sum that up quickly, the electrons are shot through the slits. When you're not looking, they behave like waves when they hit the backboard. When you are looking, they behave like particles. There's just the single electron particle marks.
Good summary, yes.
Yes.
So this is just one example of one field of science in which like this observer and system effects interact. I think it's a bit sketchy to immediately call that like, oh, consciousness influences the external world or something. That's fine, but we will get into some cool theories of, for instance, why consciousness is unable to be explained by certain like materialist or physical theories of the world, and where certain scientists and philosophers are proposing that maybe consciousness is the fundamental reality, and that physics and material worlds emerge from that. So things like that. There's definitely some crazy shit going on, and we're gonna look into it.
We're going balls deep, guys.
That's right. So we'll get into a lot more detail, but for now, I think we'll just do some intros on ourselves. Does that sound good? Do you want to go first?
Sure. I have less expertise than Giordano over here. Basically, I have just been looking into metaphysics slash spirituality for the last 6 or so years. This started basically by reading a book by a neuroscientist who had a near-death experience and didn't really believe in God. He was baptized Christian or whatever, but he kind of lost his faith when he learned about science, kind of the same as myself in high school when I learned about evolution and such. Even though I was going to a Christian school, I was just like, oh, obviously this is the truth, and I didn't tie that into potentially fitting with any sort of spiritual world whatsoever. But basically that's what happened to this guy. The book is called Proof of Heaven, written by Eben Alexander. He was a neurosurgeon, as I mentioned. And after this near-death experience, he experienced other dimensions. He experienced a spirit guide, and he was able to see what was going on with his body while he was in a coma state, and he was able to pick up on the conversations that were being had with his family members while he was in a coma, even though that should be impossible. He came back from this experience and decided to stop neurosurgery, even though he was saving people's lives all the time, and to start spreading the word, not in a religious way, but just the fact that there are other dimensions out there and there is an afterlife, and he felt that he could help people's lives even more than the neurosurgeries he was performing. That opened my eyes up big time. That also kickstarted both my ex-girlfriend and I down a big spiritual path of learning about other dimensions, spirit guides, learning about meditation, eventually learning about plant medicines, and experimenting with some of those plant medicines. And here I am today. I had some other worldly or ghostly encounters in my, I guess, teenage years, especially at the old house that we lived in, which our dogs would bark at random corners of that house. And apparently someone that my mom knew who was in the house said there are spirits here, and she could apparently see spirits and whatever. But I firsthand experienced them through the form of them playing musical instruments in our house, which sounds crazy, but I have a couple friends who were also in the house with me at the same time to confirm that I wasn't just losing my mind.
And you guys weren't on any substances
No
at the
drugs.
time. You guys were
this was pre-drug years
Yeah.
that we experienced that. I'll get into the details of that story at another time, but all these little tidbits of information were enough breadcrumbs on my path to keep me going down this rabbit hole, if you want to call it that, and come to an understanding that there definitely is other realms outside of the dimension that we find ourselves in here in the 3D world. The best way I can describe dimensions is that our eyes are tuned to see within a certain light range. Our ears are tuned to hear within a certain decibel range. And I'm sure there's other sensory measurements that I'm not aware of that we feel or smell within a certain spectrum as well. But basically, that is the dimension that we're programmed into. And beyond those light ranges, beyond those decibel ranges, are other ranges of experience that could be had potentially by other animals or other beings, namely spiritual beings. And in those further spectrums are other dimensions. And within those other dimensions, there can be obviously other beings. A lot of people believe when people are done with their life here, their soul carries on, or their consciousness carries on into those other realms where further experience and learning can be had. A lot of these dimensions are accessible through plant medicines or through deep meditation or through near-death experiences, and those are the three areas that I've studied the most over the last 6 years. And we will get into each one of those separately and tie them into together, but that is the bulk of my understanding of other worlds and inner worlds.
Right on.
Mind is also a dimension that we'll talk about lots. We are multidimensional beings, even just as a human being. Like, we have an aspect of mind, an aspect of body. Everyone will agree on those things, and a lot of people will agree that we have an aspect of soul as well. So mind, body, soul, all different dimensions, all very important in terms of living a fulfilled life. All three of those need to be in a good balance and be taken care of in order for us to feel whole and complete. And we'll get into each one of those, but basically in terms of health, you can't neglect any of those three, otherwise you will feel a little bit off, and we can unpack more of that at a later time. But I'm going to throw it over to Jordan to talk about his background with science and maybe your background with spirituality as well.
Yeah, before I do that, I want to just give a disclaimer. So here is where me as a scientist listening to what Zach says kind of reels back in a lot of cases, and I feel like other scientific minded people also do that when they listen to like spiritual types talk about their view of the world and like interpretations of things and whatnot. So I like personally for years on most of what you just said, I would call like BS. Like, how can you know that stuff? Like, that's just not empirical understanding. Like, you can never test any of that. How can you possibly call that a truth or a piece of knowledge? I still definitely reel back a lot at hearing that stuff, but I'm definitely more open-minded to it in a few levels. First of all, I don't necessarily attribute like 100% truth to anything in general. I think as a scientist, you're kind of trained to always have like a somewhat decision tree of like probabilities of like, this could be true with some level of probability. This could be an alternative to that truth. Obviously there's like some mathematical truths, like a triangle's angles add up to 180 degrees or something. Like, there's things that you can state with certainty given like your setup of that. And that's where I definitely want to have a full episode on like ways of knowing things. So
Ontology, epistemology.
Yeah, exactly. So as scientists, we're very used to scientific epistemology of like gaining understanding of
Through
the
knowledge.
Yeah, gaining gaining knowledge of the external world through empirical means, where experiment is always like the arbiter of truth. Like if you can't do an experiment, I mean, your theory is you're stuck with like string theory or something. Like you're not adequately describing reality. That's basically the scientific worldview, is that you can have all these models, you can write down all the math, and that's a huge part of science. But at the end of the day, for something to be said to be like
Fact.
yeah, so again, we never quite get to like fact or truth in science. It's more so like this is the best model we have up till this point, and potentially it could be proven wrong in the future. That's like the scientific
Paradigms. That's why all scientific paradigms are called theories, because
Yeah,
it's
so-
the best that we know so far, and it's had enough empirical evidence to prove that this is the best that we know.
So that's a very excellent way of probing the external world, the outer worlds, as we'll call it in this podcast. And I was kind of adamant and like stuck in that worldview for a long time. I still think it's extremely like useful, and you'll get a lot of understanding. Clearly, science has been a huge success. It hasn't been around for too long. Like around the 1500s was when people were first proposing these ideas of probing the external world in a systematic way, using experiments and logic and math and stuff like this. It definitely ramped up in like 1700s, and then I'd say the late 1800s, early 1900s were the golden age of true discoveries. And then obviously technology just boomed from there. Like, I mean, we have things we're recording on right now. Is the amount of complexity in just this recording setup is unfathomable. So, I mean, we can get into that in a lot of detail. But again, I was kind of stuck in that worldview that like this was the only way to go about it. And I definitely became somewhat nihilistic as a result. And I was definitely an atheist at the same time. I was, like, all there is this physical world. If we can't measure something, what's the point of even like talking about it?
Mm-hmm. That's essentially what nihilism is. Hey, you just don't care about anything.
Yeah, essentially, where there's no like fundamental meaning. It's all kind of just happening. Yeah. So I was caught in that for a long time.
How did you feel internally when you were seeing through that frame?
So at the start, I was like, oh, I've stumbled on pure, like, this is all I need. All I need is to acquire new propositional knowledge of the world. Like, I just need to learn new facts and scientific truths, and I'll be the happiest person ever. I don't need human relationships. I don't need to have any external things. All I need are these little facts in my head, and I'll be happy. And that made me feel very good at first, but over time, that starts to take a toll on you, I think. And you also realize, so at that time, I wasn't studying philosophy too much. So philosophy is like the scientist's spirituality, I would say.
Yes.
Like you start to not only question what your field is, so there's philosophy of science, but there's also philosophy of all sorts of other fields. Like there's phenomenology, which is philosophy around like subjective experience. There's ontology, which is like asking what truly exists. Epistemology, like asking how we can know things, ways of knowing
through probing the outer reality.
Not only that, but just ways of knowing things in general, like
Right.
ways of knowing, all sorts of layers of reality.
Ontology is ways of knowing through experience. Yes.
No, ontology is like existence. It's like what is reality? What truly exists?
What is the taste of chocolate?
I think that would be like phenomenology. So ontology
I
is
thought everything falls in either ontology or epistemology.
so
Is that wrong?
epistemology is your like way of getting knowledge, and then ontology is the fundamental existence or the thing to be known.
Hmm.
So
So
let's say
epistemology is the method, and ontology is what is being studied.
yeah, more or less.
through a
I think that's a good enough understanding of them. Yeah, like epistemology is how you can gain that knowledge of the true reality, for instance. And there's different ontologies that people can take on, like almost like a belief of what exists. Like a scientist would believe in a materialist ontology where all there is matter. So matter is the thing that exists, and then you can get things coming out of that, like experience and consciousness and stuff. That's what a materialist would think, is that matter can produce conscious experience. But then you can have like idealist ontology where you believe that matter is a product of consciousness, for instance, or reality is truly unknowable and all we see are like constructions of it in our minds, things like that. So we'll get into those in a lot more detail. This is very long-winded, but all I wanted to say is that eventually I realized there's different layers to the scientific worldview that even if you like, so I personally don't believe like with 100% fact that there's like these near-death experiences that are truly reflective of like a heaven or wherever you go after you die. But instead of, whereas before I'd say that's zero probability, that's like a delusion that these people are having, I'm much more open to these things. And even if they're not true, the openness to other dimensions of existence is very impactful on feeling fulfilled and meaning in your life.
How so?
So meaning in life, like there's obviously debates on whether there's any meaning to life or ultimate meaning, or whether you create your own meaning, things like that. I don't know what my full stance on that is, but I think that there are potentially multiple meanings that you can have in your life and that essentially are created by yourself. As far as my view is on it at the moment. So I don't think you necessarily need to believe in a god, for instance. You don't need to follow Christianity or Islam or other religions, but those contain very adequate components that aren't like propositional in nature. What that means is like, I don't need to believe in the existence of a god who is good, who is all powerful. Like these are propositions. Like it's a proposition that a god exists out there that is influencing our world affairs and all this stuff. Like these are little like facts or something that you believe in.
Beliefs.
But then, yeah, so that's like the propositional side of religion, which as an atheist, you deny all those propositions. You're like, God doesn't exist.
Blah,
blah, blah.
I'll jump in on the atheist thing, because when I was atheist, it's like, because I think these people are wrong about God existing, for example, that means there's no truth to be had in anything that they say, and anything that they say is bullshit, so I'm just not going to pay attention.
Exactly. This is where I'm going with this, is that you discount all the beneficial sides of, for instance, even participating in a shared belief is extremely powerful. Like that in itself can give you so much meaning. Like even, it doesn't have to be religious belief, it can be belief in your country. Like, let's say
or your sports team, even.
or your sports team. Let's say you're getting conscripted to war and you believe in the patriotism of your country. Like, my country is good, and I'm going to defend my country and its citizens. You will have meaning inherently. I think that almost defines the meaning in your life in that moment, and you will go to war for your country. I think right now we in many aspects we have lost religious meaning, we've lost nationalist meaning, we've lost a lot of types of meaning in our lives.
That's an interesting one that you bring up with war, because that can be also the dark side of meaning, where you believe so much in your country that you're willing to kill for it and put an end to the freedom of other beings
And this
in
is
the name of your
so this is actually
cause.
where so Nietzsche in like the 1800s had proclaimed God as dead. Like, God is dead and we have killed him. And all the atheists are like, yeah, go Nietzsche, we killed God, fuck yeah. But what Nietzsche's really saying is like, do you realize what we have done? We have killed like the
meaning.
We've killed the meaning. There will now
what
be
people saw as meaning.
Right. So this will descend into like nihilism and replacements for that meaning. Like, we'll get, I don't know if he stated this explicitly, but it's somewhat implied in this, that things like nationalist meaning, people like tyrants like Hitler and whatnot, like if you look into these like Nietzschean prophecy type things, it's quite jarring and scary, like how much was foreseen. Like, this was in like I think the late 1800s, and then shortly after, like 30 to 50 years after, are these two world wars stemming out of more or less like this nationalist tyrant, what's the word, there's a word that I can't think of, where the individuals in a system are behaving for a common interest or a common good, but that thing is not a good, it's kind of an evil. So that's somewhat what seemed to happen in those times. I
think that's how all wars are. It's because all people are believing that this cause is good when it's not. Right.
So yeah, I'll cut this discussion there. I think that just having some practice, some like openness to a spiritual side of life is super meaningful. Literally, like that gives you meaning in your life. You don't have to have that propositional belief in these gods. I don't have to believe in like, the new age beliefs of like a creator or like this cosmic consciousness and stuff. But if I'm more open to what you're saying, and that's what I'm going to be in this podcast as a scientist, like I think that's only better for me. And this is what, after probably 10-20 minutes of me discussing this is like the core of the disclaimer I'm giving to scientific minded people, is that you don't have to take things that Zach says literally or as truth, but if you just come along for the ride, I think that's going to be the core and most important thing. Is it's like reading poetry. It's like you're not necessarily taking the words literally. It's like you're letting what your mind flows through these words. You're letting that influence your internal mind and shape your frameworks and reality and whatnot,
and to dislodge us from the frameworks we see life through.
Exactly. Yeah, it's so easy to, like, when I was in that atheist nihilist scientific person state, I thought I was open-minded. I was like, oh, I'm so open-minded to things, but I think that's just delusional. And I think people can get easily caught in delusions like that. So
me too. Even like seeing things through a spiritual lens has made me seem like I or we as a new age collective have more more basis in the world because we're the ones coming from a place of love instead of needing scientific facts to build off. And if you're coming too much from any walk of life, I feel like it creates too much pride and you become closed-minded and too focused within those limited parameters of life, when really all of that's bullshit, and you need to just keep an open mind with all things, because there's truth in all things, and trust your ability and your judgment to take the things that you believe are good and can serve your own life and the lives of those around you in a beneficial way.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of what avenue is bringing you those truths, it doesn't matter. It just, as long as you trust yourself to be able to put your own filter on things, that you can either adopt into your own life or let go of, then you're gonna walk away a better person, as long as you keep that open
and
mind.
like at the end of the day, like I think you can believe whatever you want, just don't be a dick. Don't be just be nice to people. Like you can do whatever you want in your head. You can believe in this flying spaghetti monster. You can believe in Christian God and I don't know if Buddhists have like a god really, but they have their own set of beliefs. You can do whatever you want, but just living a good life out of that is most important as a human, I think.
Yeah.
So with that, I will
hold on, I'm gonna throw one more thing out there.
Okay.
Being that we live in North America, and I think most of our listeners will be from North America as well, Christianity has been the biggest religion in these parts. And because of that, and because the Bible is written in parable, which is basically all figurative language and nothing literal in the whole fucking thing, I didn't know that growing up. And I was like, what do you mean kill the gays and what would do all this shit? Which I think still a lot of them believe. But so much of this book has been taken literally. And especially now in our modern times, it's like what the fuck are you even saying?
Yeah, I think that's why it's so easy
in
to
these passages.
It's so easy to discount the whole system as bullshit.
When it was never meant to be taken literal, even when it was written. So it was written to have lessons within it, as like you're reading a fictional story and you're supposed to take the lessons from this fictional story and see how that can apply to your life. I didn't see it that way. I saw it as literal, and I was trying to take every story as like the literal thing and trying to extract a lesson based out of that framework of mind, and it was just like, this is retarded. I'm never going to read this ever in my life. But that's not the proper mindset to have with it. So I'm like, I honestly hate speaking in figurative language, and I'm probably rarely ever going to draw on Bible verses in this podcast, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Like, you might have a certain opinion on a certain walk of life, and you think you know everything about it, when really, like in this example, I knew nothing about the Bible and how even to approach it. But to approach things with an open mind and to not take things so literally, and to try and be open to the lessons that anything is trying to teach you, that's the best way to go about it, because then you can take things with a grain of salt and everything. And like even a crazy person out in the world will have something to teach you if you keep an open mind. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to always be us taking truth from people who have the results in life. If you have an open mind, open enough to see the good in all people, you will be a better person, because you won't be missing out on the wisdom that half the population or a certain amount of percentage of the population has to teach you. Mm-hmm. Anyways, with all that being said from both of us, what's your scientific background, bro?
Yeah, so I am currently in my 5th year as a PhD student at the University of British Columbia. I'm taking medical physics, where I'm doing neuroimaging, so brain imaging, primarily of people with Parkinson's disease, in order to understand how their brains are affected by the neurodegenerative disorder that they suffer from.
Degenerates.
Don't you dare
That's all
call
I heard.
those sweet angels degenerate.
Okay, they are sweet angels.
So they are sweet angels, and with Parkinson's, it is still somewhat mysterious in the initiation, but at some level, their dopamine neurons begin to die in their sort of midbrain, like brainstem, so like lower midbrain area. So their dopamine neurons start to die, and dopamine, as you probably know, is a very, very important molecule for healthy brain functioning. It helps with movement, with general thinking, cognition, and famously it's related to reward. And people say like pleasure, but it's more of like a reward calculator in your brain.
I've heard it's the anticipatory hormone.
Yeah, so it's related to anticipation and
drive
and things like that. So in this disease, they tend to have many adverse effects, but you can clearly see the motor effects when you're looking at someone with Parkinson's. Like they're typically shaking at a pretty steady frequency or rate. It's harder for them to engage in motion and whatnot. So my work is working with these brain scanners to measure dopamine in their brain at some level. I won't go into the details, but essentially trying to better understand this disease. Before I was doing this current program, I was at the University of Guelph with Ralph Gellert as my supervisor. He is a badass German guy. He's like 6'8", nice, great guy. Designed instruments for the Mars rovers that are currently on Mars.
He designed them?
Yeah, he was chain smoking in a German laboratory with his I think supervisor for the first instruments. So on the Spirit, Opportunity, and then later the Curiosity rover, he developed and built the instruments for those.
So 3 rovers?
Yeah, 3 rovers on Mars.
Dang.
So I got to work with him.
Was he always chain smoking as he worked with you?
No, I think he was on the vape by the time I was with him. But he's a good guy. So fortunately for me, I got to work alongside NASA with that project. So we would do daily conference calls with the rover operation team. We got to tell our instrument what to do each day. We got to name rocks on Mars. There's a rock named Calgary on Mars after the city we're from. There's a rock named...
Did you name that shit?
Yeah, there's a rock... Well, okay, so they gave us a list of like possible names. I'm like, oh shit, Calgary's on there. I gotta pick Calgary for sure. Banff is on there.
So Jordan was naming rocks on Mars, and then he's like, boring, and he fucking changed careers into medical physics.
Yeah, at the end of the day, to me, they're just rocks. A geologist would be offended. So I'm sorry to geologists.
The opportunity of a lifetime.
Yeah, so to me, Mars is the cool thing. The instrument's the cool thing. But like at the end of the day, the rocks weren't super interesting to me.
Neither was sending just code to the rovers, I thought, right? That's also wasn't your cup of tea.
Well, it was fine. It's not like so the code was like just preset, already uploaded to the rover. So like they would just tell it what to run. So it's not like we were like writing new code for the
I thought you were
instrument. My thesis was related to analyzing data coming back from the rover. So it wasn't like anything to do with telling the rover to do new things.
This
like
data
teaching it
had
new
to
tricks.
This data was lasers and shit. What was it?
No, so there is a laser on the rover, and that's actually like our competitor. Was the ChemCam instrument, where it would shoot a laser at rocks, and then based on what chemicals are in the rock, it would shoot out information, and they would acquire it. So if you've seen the rover's head, it has like little eyes. inside those eyes are lasers. So essentially, the
The rover is an X-Man.
yeah, the rover is an X-Man with laser beam eyes
Dang.
that then detect the output light from those rocks. And that's the big market pitch. That
That sounds sick. That wasn't your guys' deal?
No.
That was your competition?
So our
so there's multiple instruments on the same rover, and
Yeah.
one is run by a certain group and another is run
yeah,
by
I think
another
that
group?
group's mostly in France and then some in the States.
They
and
sound cool. I don't know. They
then-
sound cooler than your group, whatever the fuck you guys did.
Yeah, so our prof didn't like them necessarily because they made these big claims and they had this big laser, but he didn't believe in the science they was doing. He didn't really think it was like real science. In
How
terms
do you
of
dispute that if it's sending signals back?
well,
And
there's a
I
lot
would
of
imagine
detail.
that data would be shared.
There's a lot of detail. So they get chemical compositions. That's their goal of shooting this laser, is to get a chemical composition from the rock.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to calibrate that at some level, and you need to basically convert all this, like the frequencies of light you get measured back from the rock, into a chemical composition at the end of the day. And he didn't quite believe that the way they were arriving at their chemical compositions was accurate or or like good science. He thought it was they were kind of like BSing something along the way.
Do you agree with that?
I don't. So I think he definitely, like, they're definitely making very grandiose marketing claims to make sense. You want to like get funding to be on the next Mars rover, which they successfully did. And so two of my colleagues were like studying that instrument, not even our own instrument. I was working on our own instrument, and they were basically gathering intel, like they were like little spies trying to understand this other instrument. And over their 2-year masters, they kind of convinced themselves and our supervisor that what the other group's doing is actually like pretty legit. So that was like the end story of that. Our instrument is on the rover's arm, so it has an arm that it extends down to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
It shoots out alpha particles, which are just helium nuclei.
Mm-hmm.
So
let's not get back into
no,
nucleuses.
nucleuses is
guys.
now not a
Nuclei.
homie of the show. So it would lower down this arm with our instrument on it to the rock surface. It would shoot out alpha particles and X-rays, and those would hit the atoms in the rocks. And based on what atoms are in the rock, they would shoot out like a fingerprint or characteristic spectrum related to each atom. So we could tell like how much manganese, how much iron, how much sodium, potassium, stuff like that are in the rock that we're measuring. So that's the chemical composition.
What is it shooting back off the rock?
The rock. So when we hit the rock atoms with our
With the
alpha
nuclei.
particles and X-rays,
Yeah.
they're shooting back their own X-rays. So X-rays are a
Okay.
wavelength of light,
Nice.
and each chemical or each atom or molecule in the rock will shoot out its own so-called characteristic
X-ray.
X-ray that we then measure, and we see like, oh, there's this much of this particular molecule, like manganese oxide or magnesium or whatever. I forget all the. I mean, it's quite a wide range of the elements. Yeah, so you're basically like understanding what rocks are on Mars and the local terrain of the rover, and mapping out the surface of Mars
That's sick.
in high detail.
Was it just your group in Guelph that was responsible for that arm on the rover?
For that instrument on the arm, there's like a drill on the arm, which was operated by NASA, and there's like a brush on the arm.
Okay.
But in terms of the arm, I believe we had. Oh no, they had a camera as well on the arm that takes some pretty cool pictures. You can look up like the Curiosity pictures. I think it's been. I mean, it was 2012, so it's been over 10 years now of being on the surface. So there's a ton of pictures you can look up online. Anyways, that's a long exploration into that program. Before that, I did my undergrad at Calgary in physics. Yeah, I guess like learning physics. I think that's like the courses, just like learning about physics in a rigorous way, going through textbooks and professors teaching you physics was my favorite part of physics. I like learning about new things. Research is fun too, but that's more like myself trying to solve one singular question, whereas I'm not gaining tremendous amounts of new knowledge.
You haven't learned from professors and textbooks in quite some time, right?
Yeah, no, not really. Unless
How
it's
many
like
years has it been?
Like
Pre-PhD is the last time you went to class and learned from a professor in
well, I
textbook?
had classes in my PhD, but they were like medical physics classes, which aren't as interesting to me
Oh, really?
because it's not like finding new fundamental physics like quantum physics or relativity of gravity and stuff. It's more applying how particles can fly through human bodies and kill cancer and stuff, which is awesome, but it's just not as
Not as leading
interesting.
edge for you.
Not as bleeding edge exactly.
Bleeding? I said leading.
Oh, bleeding is like
bleeding edge.
I think bleeding is the actual common.
It's the bleeding edge.
Yeah, that's
of
the actual
science.
term, and you're making fun of me. You
What? Leading edge is the term.
no bleeding,
What the fuck?
bleeding edge. Yeah,
We need like a guy to Google shit.
yeah. Where's the fucking?
We'll be taking applications, guys. Anyone that wants to be our Google dick.
Yeah,
please
Google
sign up.
Google Dick sign up in the comments.
Please don't Google the word dick. But
Yeah, so
Yes.
that's my scientific background. My idol in science is Richard Feynman. He's what got me into physics. He's got great books, great lectures on YouTube. He's long dead now, rest in peace, but he was around during the World War II, like Oppenheimer stuff. He's in the movie Oppenheimer playing the bongos at some point. If you've watched The Boys, he's the main guy in The Boys, but he's in the movie Oppenheimer as Richard Feynman. I would encourage people interested in science to look up him if you don't know him already. His physics videos kind of got me into this field.
you've always been into fine men.
That's right. I'm into Feynman. So, yeah, that's about all I want to say with regards to that.
Nice. Thank you very much. So basically, you started in general physics. You went on to somewhat astrophysics. Is that
No, it'd be
It
more like
wasn't
planetary science,
planetary
but still physics.
science?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know shit about this. To me, anything in space is astrophysics, but obviously that's
No,
not right.
that's not.
Planetary science, which would just be like instruments that we use on planets.
Yeah, or just understanding planets or in our solar system, more or less.
Okay.
Yeah.
Carrying on now into medical physics and how physics can apply to instruments that we use on the body.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, who knows where this guy will go. He's all over the map with physics, but
Yeah,
it's cool to have the breadth of knowledge that you have, because I think that's valuable.
Yeah, so I think this degree has gotten me more interested in the brain and mind and consciousness and conscious experiences related to how the brain functions. Like, you can understand how psychedelic drugs and molecules interact with certain brain receptors to produce the experiences that you have on those trips, for instance. Andrew Gallimore, who Zach is reading one of his books now, but
Read. Done.
you're done?
It only took me
Took him like a year. It's not very
for a
big.
tiny ass book. Like
You're
300
gonna have to
pages.
read faster to keep up with podcast topics. So.
I was like getting used to the terminology, you guys, so give me some slack. I had to read each sentence like 5 times, so it was really like I read a 1,000-page book.
That's impressive then.
Thank
But now you got to read his next book, unfortunately for you. But it's a great
I'm
book.
looking forward to it.
So that book talks about specifically how drug molecules interact with receptor sites in the brain, and how you can almost never have done the drug and predict what effects that drug will have on a person's behavior and subjective experiences. Because, so for instance, he goes through different drugs like psilocybin, LSD, and how those interact with the serotonin receptor sites.
5-HT2A receptors.
That's right. That's my
brain.
dog. How'd you know that? That's good.
I'm fancy now.
You fancy
I read
boy.
a book once.
That's good, man.
Mhm.
Wow, you're gonna be the science guy on the podcast.
Not.
Zach and I, the science guy. What was I saying? Yeah, so he goes.
Serotonin receptors.
Yeah, so he basically discusses what the serotonin receptors and neurons do in the brain. He discusses what like acetylcholine receptors and the molecule and whatnot, how that affects how your brain functions, like glutamate, other different receptor sites in the brain, dopamine and stuff like this, goes through the molecules and how they interact with those receptor sites. And just from that alone, you can kind of see what's going to come next in terms of when he then describes like experiences that people have under compounds related to these receptor sites. So it's pretty cool that you can understand the brain neurophysiology, understand the drugs and the molecules in those drugs, and then map that all into some layer of subjective conscious experience. So I think that's super cool, and I think you will too when you read that. The book called Reality Switch Technologies, because he's basically saying that these molecules or drugs are technologies that switch our brain channel from producing the consensus reality that me and you are both experiencing right now to producing different realities, because at the end of the day, our brain is what's constructing reality. Our brain isn't just measuring objective reality and like kind of and interpreting or mapping down objective reality. Our brain is literally constructing reality from the ground up, more or less, based on sensory inputs that it's getting.
Yeah, so think of, it's not just the external sensory information being translated into electrical impulses in our brain. It's the receptor sites themselves constructing how the external information is received.
That too, yeah.
So when the receptor sites themselves are changed through a new drug binding to them, it's not just the external information that's new through a drug compound entering the body. It's the receptor sites themselves that are changing from the brain or the grid up.
So I'll
creating then a feedback loop of
so
information flow to going upwards and downwards, and like it's crazy, guys. It's crazy.
Here's an interesting one.
It's such a miracle how drugs impact the body and the mind. We'll unpack it in much greater detail for you, but it's essentially going from the ground up and the top down
exactly.
simultaneously. Yeah.
So here's a cool example from the book. So the molecule acetylcholine is related to. So this is going to be simplifying. So he's simplifying this down to a level I can understand, and now I'm going to be simplifying this a bit too. And I also read the book like over a year ago, so this might be incorrect.
The channel switch book or the
the channel
reality
switch book.
switch.
But I'm going to do my best with this. But I still think it's super cool. So this acetylcholine basically tells your brain model how much to trust the external information coming in. So for instance, if you're walking around at night, it's pitch black in your house, it's the information coming in is not as trustworthy, so it's going to be signaling a low amount of this molecule. It's going to be saying, don't trust your external reality.
Wow.
Trust what's like more or less in your head right now. Like you kind of know the map of your house, for instance, like in your head, and you can kind of stumble your way around. There's a drug which I can't recall exactly. It might be scopolamine or it might be something completely else. So excuse me if that's incorrect. But this drug basically induces that state where it reduces your trust in the external information, and that in itself produces a very strong subjective drug trip where someone can be in the living room of the house and think truly they truly experience this. It's not like they're making this up. They truly experience having a dinner party with other people, and
in their brain.
So their brain's constructing this out of, because the brain's not trusting external senses. So the eyes would be seeing that the room has no one in it, but their brain has lost signal from the external senses and is now sort of like extrapolating and building its own world model, and sort of like a dream state where it's like just doing whatever it wants. So a person can have a full conversation to nobody, full dinner party on this drug, and that's clearly quite a dangerous thing.
On this drug.
Yeah, so you can think a murderer is coming to kill you and you can have a psychotic episode type thing. So like this drug can be quite maladaptive to like to safe living and stuff. But it's just a cool example of how you can start to understand how if one system is suppressed or amplified in the brain, you can get very intense subjective experiences out of it that are quite well understood just by understanding like the neurochemical system.
So this dinner party example, did they hold on to that as a memory afterwards?
Yeah, so they would that would be their reality. Just as I'm perceiving you in a chair in front of me, they would be perceiving that and calling that their reality. Because at the end of the day, what the brain is constructing is what you perceive as reality, whether the brain is,
whether it was there or not,
whether the brain's hooked into like the external world or not. Whatever the brain's constructing is your reality. It's like when you're in a dream, it feels real,
right?
But that wasn't, something that actually was happening,
right?
Unless you believe in like dreams as, But anyways,
and this is where this stuff can be debated, because like taking plant medicines, for example, and the dimensions thing I brought up earlier, it could be that we are broadening our spectrum to what we're perceiving into different dimensions that are outside of the scope of what we normally see within this light range, for example, or whatever you want to call it.
But yeah, you're using that as an analogy, but I see what you're saying. Yeah.
But it could be that all these things are already there. All this information is already here and now, but we don't perceive it because our brains have evolved to only see the things that are necessary for our survival. And when we take these other psychedelics and things, or other drugs or compounds, different things like that change the brain, all of a sudden it's not necessarily hallucinations. It could be that we're peering into another dimension that's always existing here and now, but because the spectrum of what we can observe is broadened, or it is switched to a different spectrum, all of a sudden we're seeing faces or beings or
and like
different light patterns.
Somewhat controversially, this neuroscientist Andrew Gallimore proposes in his other book, like the alien information theory, that the DMT world you go to when you take DMT is not just like a fabrication of the mind. Like that is a truly otherworldly dimension. So you don't have to take Zach's word for it. You also don't have to take Gallimore's word for it. It's just like people are putting real credence into this idea that these perceived states have some, we would say, ontological relevance, or they're actually existing on some level, instead of just being like a fabrication from the mind, for instance. And that's what I've become more open to as well, is that typically in science we like to think that we could take like criticism that our current theories aren't correct and deal with that humbly. In science, it turns out that you tend to kind of mold your explanations in response to criticism and sort of try to re-justify your point of view. So, for instance, in the 1800s, professors were telling students not to go into physics because physics was solved. Like, they figured it all out, man. We figured out electromagnetism and heat. What else is there? There's nothing else. We figured it out.
So funny.
You're gonna waste your time if you go into physics, and that was just like a complete joke because that's the furthest thing from the truth. They were not even close to like knowing the true nature of what's going on. So thankfully, people kept challenging the current paradigm and pushing past it. And right now, we're definitely in a paradigm. People are definitely trying to challenge it, but if you're not challenging it from all different angles and perspectives, you could potentially be stuck in that paradigm and not make progress for a long time. So people are trying to challenge it, and I'm trying to be more open to other alternatives.
I think we always have to be challenging things because I think there's been enough transformational discoveries of and like paradigm shifts in society on so many levels that it's almost become clear, I think, to everyone that the reality is infinity in all directions. Like, you can forever get better at anything. Like, they've also claimed before that all the music to ever be created has been written. Like, I forget who was saying that. Certain, like, famous musicians and composers back in the day were saying, like, don't bother trying to make more music because it's all been made already.
Yeah.
And obviously, that's a joke. Like, you can make an infinite amount of songs. All that needs to change is like the tempo, even, or like changing the chords from an A.
Minor pedantic interruption, but if you calculate from an information theory mathematics point of view how many possible songs can exist, it is a finite number.
What?
But it's very, very large. It's just the amount of information you can pack into each microsecond or nanosecond of a song. But
a song can go on infinitely long, though.
That's the assumption you have to make, is that we don't have infinite amount of time, and that's so.
Fuck you.
Yeah. Anyways, this is actually a cool type of theorem in information science. When we talk about information theory, we might talk about this because it's. Anyways, it's cool to me, but fuck you. Go on.
No, fuck you.
No, fuck you.
Fuck you.
Fuck you.
Fuck you. Anyways, it's silly to think that we know everything ever. There's always going to be more to discover. And no matter what area of life it is, there will be more and more. What? You got something to say?
No, I was just gonna say, can probably start to wrap this up.
Yeah. Anyways, guys, if you're still with us, thank you very much. We respect your ear holes and your attention, and directing your ear holes at us. Coming up, speaking of alien information theory, we will be getting to an episode that has to do with that, kind of like a book report on these DMT realities and what dimensions exist beyond ours and how to access them through plant medicines containing DMT or through animals that have DMT within them. There are different types of DMT.
Oh, you're talking about the bufo toad.
That's right.
Yes.
Along this journey, we will also have trip reports. We have pre-recorded some future episodes already where I will be talking about my 5-MeO DMT experience. We'll be talking about different theories of science, such as atomic theory, which we also have an episode coming up for. There will be other. I'm sure we'll do quantum field theory along.
Yeah,
the
we'll
way.
do quantum. We'll do relativity and gravity.
We'll talk about AI.
Yeah.
We'll talk about spiritual realms or an afterlife. We'll talk about near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Any other subjects that you want to mention that we will discuss as well? Beyond what we already said.
Oh, like things related, philosophical topics. We'll do that episode on ways of knowing. Yeah, I think that's. I mean, we'll get into so much detail in the future. Like we'll branch off and whatnot, and we'll figure
There's
out.
an infinite amount of shit we can talk about, guys, because it's reality at large, and it's through any method that exists, through science.
Yeah, we're
or through
covering all
spirituality.
bases. Yeah.
All bases. There's an infinite amount of shit. So buckle up. It's going to be a fun ride, and we plan on doing this for a long time. We appreciate your support of this podcast. The only way to do that is to share and to join us weekly as we continue to learn about reality. Thank you, guys. We love you. We'll talk to you soon.